Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the paradise before He created mankind. And Allah Azza wa Jal, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He created the paradise, He sent off Jibreel alayhi salam to look at the paradise. And then Jibreel looked at the paradise, he came back to Allah and he said, Ya Allah, anyone that would know of the paradise want to be part of it. Anyone that would know of the paradise would want to enter it. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala surrounded the paradise with hardships. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded Jibreel alayhi salam once again to go and look at the paradise. When Jibreel looked at the paradise the second time after Allah surrounded the paradise with the hardships, which means that your way to the paradise and the way you could obtain and achieve the paradise is that you need to face and you need to go through hardships. He came back and he said, Ya Allah, I fear that after you've surrounded the paradise with hardships, none of your servants will end up in the paradise. The paradise, my brothers and my sisters, it is the property of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the expensive property of Allah. When the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he says, Ala inna sil'atallahi ghaliya, ala inna sil'atallahi al-jannah. The property of Allah is expensive and the property of Allah is the paradise. And the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam describes this world that we live in as a preparation, as a stepping stone to the paradise. We're only in this world temporary to prepare ourselves for the hereafter, the paradise. And one of the most beautiful comments that Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, he says that if you want to enter the paradise of Allah in the hereafter, you need to experience the paradise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this world. And the paradise of Allah Azza wa Jal in this world is the worship of Allah and the obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the obedience of Allah Azza wa Jal. The worship of Allah and the submission to Allah. The worship of Allah and the adherence to the will of Allah Almighty. That's why, my brothers and my sisters, we are in this world as only a world of trial and tests. Allah Azza wa Jalla, He says, هو الذي خلق الموت والحياة ليبلوكم أيكم أحسن عملا. Allah is the one that created death and life to test you to see who are the best of doers. Who does the best of actions? Who does the best of deeds? Those deeds that please Allah, in return they achieve and obtain the paradise. Those deeds that they do to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in return they gain the paradise. So what are those deeds that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give us in return if we do them, the paradise? What are those deeds that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will grant us and reward us? If we do them, He will reward us the paradise. Well, first and foremost is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala repeats in many different verses in the Quran al-Kareem, the belief in Allah. The belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the first step into achieving and acquiring the paradise. Allah Azza wa Jalla, He says, وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ أُولَٰئِكَ أَصْحَابُ الْجَنَّةِ هُمْ فِيهَا خَالِدُونَ. Those who believe in Allah and do righteous actions. Those who believe in Allah. So the first thing that you need to do is believe in Allah. Those who believe in Allah and do righteous actions, they are the ones in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will admit into the paradise eternally and forever. So the first action, the first deed that we must be part of and we must do for us to achieve and for us to gain the paradise, for us to enter the paradise, is that we believe in Allah. We believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wholeheartedly from our hearts, sincerely and purely for the sake of Allah. I believe in Allah. I love Allah. I obey Allah. I adhere to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I submit to Allah. I surrender to Allah. This is the Iman. I believe in the oneness of Allah. And I believe in the great attributes of Allah. And I believe in everything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had described Himself. I surrender to Allah. I believe in what Allah Azza wa Jalla commanded me to believe in. This is the Iman that Allah is referring to. وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ أُولَٰئِكَ أَصْحَابُ الْجَنَّةِ هُمْ فِيهَا خَالِدُونَ. Those who believe in Allah, do the righteous actions, that are those who shall enter the paradise and will enter the paradise. They shall live in the paradise forever. Secondly, my brothers and my sisters, taqwa Allah. Being mindful of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Fearing Allah Azza wa Jal. in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in many verses, Allah Azza wa Jalla mentions, إِنَّ الْمُتَّقِينَ فِي جَنَّاتٍ وَعْيُونٍ. Indeed, those who fear Allah, the muttaqeen, those who do righteous actions, those who fear Allah Azza wa Jal, those who are mindful of Allah, those who are conscious of Allah. إِنَّ الْمُتَّقِينَ فِي جَنَّاتٍ وَعْيُونٍ. Indeed, those who fear Allah and are mindful of Allah shall enter the paradise, فِي جَنَّاتٍ وَعْيُونٍ, in paradise and beautiful springs. And beautiful springs in the paradise. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in other verses says, إِنَّ لِلْمُتَّقِينَ مَفَازًا. Indeed for those who fear Allah, indeed for the muttaqeen are a great success. There is a great success for them. And what greater success than the success of entering the paradise? So taqwa Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah Azza wa Jal also says, وَسَارِعُوا إِلَى مَغْفِرَةٍ مِّن رَبِّكُمْ وَجَنَّةٍ عَرْضُهَا السَّمَاوَاتُ وَالْأَرْضُ أُعِدَّتْ لِلْمُتَّقِينَ. Allah Azza wa Jalla says, compete one another to the paradise. Compete one another to the forgiveness of Allah and to the paradise, that the width of this paradise is as wide as the heavens to the earth. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he says, the most action that admits people to the paradise is the fear of Allah. To have that fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in your heart. To be always mindful of Allah. You always remember Allah. You're always conscious of Allah. You're always obeying Allah. And may Allah Azza wa Jalla have mercy upon Ali ibn Abi Talib radiyallahu ta'ala anhu when he says, At-taqwa huwa al-khawfu min al-jalil. Taqwa is that you fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the most high. Wal-amalu bit-tanzil. And to act upon what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed. Wal-qana'atu bil-qalil. And to be content in what Allah has sustained you. وَالْإِسْتَعْدَادُ لِيَوْمِ الرَّحِيلِ. And to prepare yourself for the day of departure, to prepare yourself for death.